Part of the problem that we have in addressing these issues is that we don't know the entirety of our own history. Our history has been in large part stolen from us, some by miseducation and wrong assumptions, some by paradigms that keep people within a particular framework of thought because they don't know or hear counter-narratives about history, and some because it has been actively hidden from us and buried over many decades by the national security state. So even when you talk about an event like this one that happened 49 years ago today, the assassination of a major leader in the African American community, we face the problem that not all the records have been released about that period of history. They still remain classified and hidden. There has been, of course, much good independent scholarship and research on this issue and other historical issues. There has been some success using the Freedom of Information Act, but it's been limited, and so many records still remain closed. Our organization, the Coalition on Political Assassinations, was formed to help implement the JFK Records Act that we were behind, and that's been one of the most successful record releases. Over 6.5 million pages were released, but still not everything. And similar records are being held in the hundreds of thousands of pages about the life and death of Dr. Martin Luther King, which is why when I worked on the Hill for Representative Cynthia McKinney, we drafted a Martin Luther King Records Act, but we're working hard to get someone to sponsor it in Congress to get those records loose, and there are still records buried about Malcolm X and other leaders and political activists that have been killed. And this is because, as I say, we don't really own our own history. And when a people don't own their history, they are essentially a conquered people, because they cannot plug into who they are, where they came from, or what the context they live in the current day. A lot of the basis, I think, of the ability to carry out these kinds of assassinations and operations rests in a surveillance capability that earlier began in the early 1900s. Army intelligence, G2, was headed up by a Colonel Vandeman, and he began collecting records shortly after the Russian Revolution on all sorts of activists in the United States. And his lists led to the Palmer raids and massive deportations of people, as well as imprisonment of labor leaders, radicals, anarchists, and others. His files, which were quite extensive on at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people at that point, were handed over to J. Edgar Hoover at the beginning of his attempt to create the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In addition to that, military intelligence spied on people right up through the 1960s. It's not talked about as much as the CIA spying and the FBI spying, but what we're talking about today in the news is really military intelligence spying. The NSA is under the Defense Intelligence Agency. And the grandfather of Dr. Martin Luther King was spied upon by the government. And they identified people as threats to internal security all through this period. And they then began to plan responses to them, which included, at particular periods, rounding up whole segments of the population that they felt were a threat and putting them into pre-designated internment camps, much in the same way that Native Americans were pushed into reservations earlier, designated military bases, and even some of the old camps that they set up for the internment of Japanese Americans at the time of World War II. The McCarran Act, the 1950s, no longer current, talks about arresting anyone who might possibly be thinking of probably committing any act of espionage or sabotage or any plan to overthrow the government of the United States. These people could be picked up without writ of habeas corpus under the Act and put into indefinite detention for the duration of the crisis. I think those terms probably ring, if you're reading the news now, to how people are treated in this enemy combatant category. But there's a long history of this kind of thinking. And then there was a rise, certainly at the end of World War II, to both a permanent warfare economy and a national security state. What President Eisenhower warned about in his final talk, leaving office, and in his first draft, a military industrial intelligence complex was the first draft. And that complex is what much of current day activity, but going back even those 45, 50 years, determines where we are. Independent agencies were created, like the CIA, the FBI. They had no effective oversight by Congress, and they are out of control in the same way that the NSA is. FBI began to collect additional dossiers until Hoover bragged in the 1960s that he had that there were 250 million people living in America, and that he had dossiers on 200 million of them, and he wanted to close the gap. There were then in that period political assassinations that were really the purpose of the assassinations, in my view, including Malcolm, was to kill hope. Hope for social change, hope for social organizing, hope for a progressive move in the country. And our last panel we had last year at Howard University, Michael Druba-Moore spoke, and he said that political assassinations serve the purpose of changing the conversation, the context of the conversation and the social issues that are happening. Dr. King and Malcolm were spied on by the COINTELPRO program that's been mentioned, the FBI, and also a program called RIBAT, which was an anti-communist program. The CIA had its own operation called CHAOS that was targeting black militant organizations. And the Army intelligence had Lantern Spike, which was an anti-riot surveillance group, and Garden Plot, which was a martial law plan aimed at destroying not only African-American activists, but also peace activists and people working against the war and other militants that were rising in that period, all of whom were seen as enemies of the state. And at one point, the Congress discovered that the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and the Army Intelligence had records on over 8 million Americans. They then ordered them destroyed, and I actually tracked for several years all the different times that those destroyed documents reappeared at a different military base. And I found at least 8 different times, so I guess they have one more life left if they're like a cat, but these documents were destroyed and then rediscovered. And I'm sure they still exist and feed into the overall surveillance. Najee mentioned this book, The Burglary, by Betty Metzger, just out, and very important, about these independent citizen activists. I don't want to call them whistleblowers. They were like sort of whistle stealers, but they decided to break into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. And they took all the files because they didn't know what was important and what wasn't, but in the course of going through them, they discovered what she calls J. Edgar Hoover's secret FBI and the COINTELPRO programs and the targeting of individuals and groups in order to destroy them one way or the other. And that was the first public expose of what activists, I'm sure, saw as attacks on them but couldn't identify as a solid program. We're told that the COINTELPRO ended, but I think that exists quite actively under other names, and some of the speakers will make clear that the people they went after in the 1960s, it's their children that are now being targeted as well. And that figures into the Malcolm X case in my view as well. In addition to that, there were operations with all this surveillance and all this supposed threat. There were plans drawn up for martial law, like Garden Plot, for rounding up the entire black population. I mentioned to Jared at one point that Jared Ball, that the director of FEMA, Louis Gottfrieda, Federal Emergency Management Agency, got his thesis at the War College approved, and it was a thesis on how to round up all black Americans in the United States, and how to encircle them and take them into camps and move them And this was his working thesis, and Jared asked me if I thought he could get one approved if they had one to round up all the white people in the United States. You know, how far that would go. But this was an actual thing that he did, and then he became, you know, director of FEMA, and they had these martial law plans. Each year, Rex 84 was a plan to round up Central American activists and their supporters in the United States. And there was a link then made between the National Security Council, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the DOD. And it was those three agencies that came into control when they announced continuity of government after 9/11. And there were additional plans exposed during the Watergate. There was the Tom Houston Plan. I suggest people go back and look at the Tom Houston Plan. It's up at the Federation of American Scientists site. It was a plan for martial law, but it is a blueprint and outline for much of what we live under today in the post-9/11 period. In Contragate, there was exposed another martial law plan Oliver North was involved with. They went into closed session, and they came out saying there was no such plan. Much of this got exposed at some point by the Church Committee, Senate Church Committee, but money from the illegal drug operations that the intelligence agencies were involved in went into elections, and almost everybody on the Church Committee was unelected by the next round and taken out of office for even saying anything about it. But Senator Church did expose both CIA, FBI, and other agencies for a lot of criminal activity and overstretching their bounds. And it infuriated Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who then began alternate planning in the Reagan years for the continuity of government. But you know, and the first thing after 9/11, I remember this on the news in D.C., they blamed the Church Committee. They said that the Church Committee had tied the hands of the FBI and the CIA, and so they weren't able to catch the terrorists. But I mean, it goes a great deal deeper than that. But you know, that was as close as we got to any effective oversight or review. If the country ever goes to Code Red, they impose continuity of government, and they did say after 9/11 that we were in continuity of government, and a month later the FBI, the Washington Post had a headline that said shadow government operating in secret, and so they were operating out of undisclosed locations and from these bunkers. But if they ever do go to Code Red, about 150 federal legal authorities change, and the military takes over, among other things, all highways, all communication, all media, and a very small segment of people are then chosen to run the government without interference from the Congress or the population. And they do exercises on all this involving National Guard and other people right to the current day. In the instant case that we're talking about tonight, there was infiltration from almost its inception of the Nation of Islam by federal agents and FBI, and part of that infiltration took the form of creating rivalries in those organizations, because the point of COINTELPRO, which was really invented by William Sullivan and Cartha Dick DeLoach, who were naval intelligence operatives who came into the FBI at the end of World War II and set up the Domestic Operation Division there, and were instrumental in several of these assassinations. But the infiltration there included trying to destroy the organization by creating rivalries, and those rivalries led to leadership that replaced Malcolm X, like Louis Farrakhan, calling for his death and talking about how a nation should treat a traitor. There was active surveillance of Malcolm by FBI, CIA, and military intelligence. There was penetration of Malcolm's security, the Organization of African Unity, by BOSSI, the Bureau of Special Services and Investigations in New York, which was a police red squad and covert operation group. There was a pattern in the King assassination and other assassinations, including Malcolm, of removal of police security prior to the event, and then the capture and incarceration of false suspects. One of the three actual shooters was captured, Thomas Hayer, but contended, I think recently paroled, but contended all the time that the other two people that were arrested were not his associates. And That's similar to the framing of people like James Earl Ray, who did not shoot Dr. Martin Luther King, the framing of Sirhan Sirhan, who did not shoot Robert Kennedy, and similarly Lee Harvey Oswald in the Kennedy case. One identified shooter is still living free, William Bradley in Newark. He denies it. Roland Shepard spoke at our last conference. He was on the scene. He was asked by one of the security guards for Malcolm to move from his usual seat up front. The three gunmen came and sat down in the seat shortly after that. He saw them do the shooting. He was taken into a police station later for questioning. He saw a man come out of the bathroom who had been the man who shot Malcolm with the shotgun. And he came out of the bathroom in the police department, went over and sat down at one of the desks. And he later, when I sent him a photo of this individual in New Jersey, he at least said that that's the person that he saw. But Zach and Kondo can talk further about that. I wanted to mention quickly the grandson and the daughter of Malcolm. One of Malcolm, to show how twisted this is, one of Malcolm's daughters was drug addicted. The FBI knew it. They sent a white drug dealer in to provide drugs to her and start a relationship with her. And he encouraged her to kill Louis Farrakhan because of this view that Louis Farrakhan had been involved in the killing of her father. So this is a generation later. They're taking the other side and having them kill the people that they set up in the first place. And I'm very suspicious of the death of Malcolm's grandson in Mexico City. I don't know how much you followed it. But COINTELPRO was renewed after 9/11. They militarized the police after the Vietnam period. Every agency has a SWAT team. And it goes right up to the current time, and I suggest this article in the new Intercept online journal it's Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill, the NSA's secret role in the U.S. assassination program. And these are actual programs where they link the drone attacks to the information that the NSA is drawing up. And assassination has become legal. And so it's linking the two. But we exist in a time of accelerated militarization and of the same agencies that created these problems being totally uncontrolled and surveilling us and threatening us. And I think that being aware of it is the first thing, but secondly, I think we need a strategy to deal with it.
Next we'll